All right, I think we're going to get started. All right, welcome everybody. My name is Chris Kennedy, and I want to welcome you to today's virtual event, Climate Change in Cities. We have a wonderful lineup of really great speakers to talk to you all today. And so kick it off with some introductions and welcomes. So today's event is being organized by the Urban Systems Lab here at the New School. I'm one of the assistant directors there, and I work with Timon McPherson, who is one of the founders of the Urban Systems Lab at the New School. And it's also co-organized by the Tishman Center for Environment and Design, also at the New School. And Mike Carrington, who's the assistant director. We've got the two co-directors here as well to tell you a little bit about TEDC and all of the wonderful work that they are doing. Today's event is going to focus primarily on the local implications of the latest UN climate report that was put up by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change back in February of this year. The IPCC repeats this historic report based on the contributions from Working Group 2, which is assessing the impacts of climate change and options for adapting to it. The report includes a chapter on cities, settlements, and key infrastructure, which considers the vulnerabilities and capacity of natural and human systems to adapt to climate change, as well as options for creating a more sustainable future through equitable and integrated approaches to both mitigation and adaptation. Today, we want to ask the question, as cities like New York and others across the US face climate-related challenges, everything from urban flooding to extreme heat, what can we learn from the latest IPCC findings? For folks who are not familiar, the New York City has its own panel on climate change. So we have several members that are both involved in the New York City panel on climate change and also the IPCC here to talk to you all about some of those implications and opportunities. We'll be joined by Dr. Anna Baptista, who's an assistant professor at the New School and co-director of the Tishman Center for Environment and Design. Sheila Foster, who is a professor at Georgetown Law. Her work focuses on urban land use policy, state and local government issues, and she's also a member of the New York City panel on climate change, where she serves as the co-chairs of the Equity Working Group. We'll also be joined by Timon McPherson, who is a professor at the New School in Urban Ecology and director of the Urban Systems Lab. Dr. McPherson is both a member of the New York City panel on climate change and also part of Working Group 2 at the IPCC. And we'll also be joined by Joel Towers, who is a professor of architecture and sustainable design at the New School and co-director of the Tishman Center for Environment and Design. He's also a co-chair of the New York City panel on climate change. And finally, today's event will be moderated by Mike Carrington, who is the assistant director at the Tishman Environment and Design Center. He works across the university to advance a number of sustainability issues and is also organizing this year's Earth Week events on campus. So welcome to all of our speakers. We really want to encourage folks to use the chat to pose any questions and to share resources. So please use that as much as you'd like. Towards the end of today's session, we'll open it up to questions and answers, but we're going to kick things off with an introduction from Timon McPherson, who will talk a little bit about the IPCC. But first, I'm going to hand it over to Mike Carrington to tell you a little bit more about Earth Week events coming up and also a little bit about his experience. All right, welcome everybody. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you, Chris, for the introduction, and I'm really glad to be here with all the panelists, two of them I work with very closely, and yeah, I'm really glad that we're having this discussion. And as Chris said, we are having our slate of Earth Week events, and it's something that the Tishman Environment and Design Center organizes pretty much every year, where we have a lot of events throughout the month. And the theme of this year is art, design, and democracy. I guess this would fall into the design and democracy, probably more into the democracy part, depending on how the questions go. But yeah, if you check out tishmancenter.org, you can scroll right down and see the number of Earth Week events that we have. And yeah, I'm looking forward to this discussion and as part of my job, I've been working on a lot of urban issues such as urban heat, energy efficiency in homes, and energy use for low and moderate income people. So these are all topics that are I'm sure will come up in our discussion. And I am happy to pass it over to Timon to give us an overview of the IPCC Working Group 2 report that he was a part of, one of the authors of. So thank you again, and looking forward to talking to the panelists later.
Great, thanks, Mike, and happy to share this space with everyone else. It's really great to be here, and thanks for all of you who have kind of shown up to participate. Looking forward to discussing things with you. As Chris and Mike said, I'm going to attempt to give a brief overview of some of the key findings, not necessarily from all aspects of the recent IPCC report, but really in the chapter that focused on cities, settlements, and key infrastructure. This is really one of the first moments in the history of the IPCC where there's been a major focus on both the impacts on cities, the vulnerabilities that exist in cities to climate change, and the adaptation options that cities have in terms of really dealing with the climate crisis and the way it impacts urban areas all around the world. Now, of course, the IPCC is providing really a global assessment, and given I am not going to make complete assumptions about who's in the audience here, but I suspect there's a number of academics. And as a colleague of mine in the IPCC said yesterday in another event, in some ways, the IPCC is really reflecting back to, especially when in terms of the academic community, what has been found in a whole suite of literature, right? This report that was released on February 28th is a summary of, if I have the number right, about 20,000 articles that have been reviewed and assessed and really trying to pulled together as a global assessment of what we know about impacts, vulnerabilities, and risks. So I'm going to attempt to do a very short, sort of high-level summary in the context of cities, and then we'll use that as a jumping off point, as Chris said, to think about this in the New York City context and what are we learning here. So I'll sort of summarize this as some key takeaways for this. So I'll just kind of jump right into it. I really just have 12 points. I'll try not to go too fast, and I'll also admit that I did not make this a pretty picture version. I wanted to just be a little bit detailed, so you won't get what I often like to do, which is make it easy on the eyes. But instead, I wanted to just get across a few key points about some of the things that we found in the urban assessment of climate change impacts, vulnerabilities, and adaptation options. The first really, and I think this is some pretty stark language coming out of the IPCC, if you think about the kinds of language that have been used in the past, is that not only is climate change framed as a threat multiplier, meaning the way in which other challenges the cities are already facing are enhanced by the climate challenge and deepened by the climate challenge, but also that there's this framing of a very likely increase in risks and impacts over the next 2 decades. That's pretty interesting, and I'm underlining it a little bit because what it's basically saying is that even if we have some very aggressive action on drawing down carbon nationally, globally, all around the world, climate impacts for the next 10 to 20 years are basically built in, and they're going to go up. So in the context of cities, this is something to take very seriously, that even with some very hopefully aggressive action on climate in terms of the mitigation side, we have an adaptation challenge that we absolutely must address that goes beyond the current challenges we face because they're projected to increase over the next couple of decades. Another key finding from the urban chapter really is probably not surprising to many of you, but this is true all across the world, is that it's clear now, perhaps more than it ever has been, that it's the poor and marginalized who are the most vulnerable to climate impacts. And if you look at the population projections in cities, as we forecast this out just in the next couple of decades, even just to 2050, which frankly isn't very far away, over 4 billion people are projected to live in these essentially hotspots for climate risk because of the way in which cities concentrate people and infrastructure and economies and makes them hotspots. And yet it's disproportionate in terms of the impacts. That's already clear. And it's likely that it will continue to be that way without adaptation that centers equity and focuses on the most vulnerable. Another key finding, and this is relevant for New York, is that coastal cities are clearly at risk. And also, if we look out just a couple decades into the future, about 1 billion people are projected to be living in low-lying coastal settlements. So if we even only focus on the context of climate change in the coastal areas, we have a pretty significant adaptation challenge to what's built in to the next couple decades. And this is true in New York, as you'll hear from some of the other panelists, I'm sure. Of course, it's not only sea level rise and coastal storms that we have to worry about, it's also extreme heat, which, as Mike mentioned, he works on. These are clearly assessed from the literature as already having an impact and likely to have an increasing impact on people across urban centers. Even one of the projections here is that perhaps, depending on the scenario that you look out into the future of climate impacts, 16 times as many people may be exposed to extreme heat in the future. So this really underlines the need to, as we look beyond the next 10 to 20 years, for really rapid and deep cuts in carbon emissions, as the concerns around heat are, non-trivial, to put it lightly. Drought and water scarcity was something that IPCC highlighted, and what we found from the literature as being an increasing concern, especially under different climate scenarios. So the future that might, by end of century, end up at 1.5 degrees, if we're extremely aggressive, recent paper, not part of the IPCC, that just came out, I think this week, says that with all the climate pledges, and if you add those up from COP26 in Glasgow last year, we have a chance of getting below 2 degrees, but they do not get us to 1.5 degrees. This was a paper that just came out in Nature earlier this week. And so this is pretty severe when you think about the ways in which cities rely on water availability, but also other aspects of drought that affect people's livelihoods in cities. So this was another sort of key risk that, when we think about adapting to climate change, is a pretty serious challenge. And this is true in multiple parts of the world. Something else that I find was kind of an interesting finding that comes out of the IPCC assessment is, and again, this feels to me, and maybe others will see this differently, as somewhat stark language also from the IPCC, is that in some areas we may not be able to adapt. We may not be able to adapt adequately for lives and livelihoods to be well protected and for good standards of living. So this is a key finding that's coming out of the urban chapter, that adaptation may frankly be limited. And when we think about what we can do in terms of adapting to the coming climate challenges that we'll be facing, some assets may be stranded, some parts of development that we've invested in cities around the world may frankly not be livable. And this is especially true for small island states and polar and mountain regions. Another key challenge here is thinking about the interaction among climate hazards, because it's not as if all of these are sort of one-off scenarios or single kinds of events, but rather the report points out that multiple climate hazards are likely to occur simultaneously more often, meaning we may have back-to-back or overlapping in time and space climate events that happen together, and that together is likely to happen more often. And of course, these have knock-on effects in terms of their impact. So they not only affect people directly, they affect infrastructure, which then affects people, and they not only affect a particular city in a particular location, but as we know from a number of events that have happened in the New York context, in the US context, and other global urban contexts, these have impacts on supply chains. Cities affect other cities, and even affect suburban, rural, and hinterland areas outside them. So this chain of interactions is something that the report is really highlighting as needing attention in terms of adaptation. So that's a brief overview of some of the key risks, pretty stark in a lot of ways in terms of thinking about what we have to do. And there are some key points that the IPCC points out that we can do. And one of these is focusing on the role of nature-based solutions and ecosystem-based adaptation. And this is really picking up on the fact that not only are we facing a climate crisis, but we're facing a biodiversity crisis, and that investing, conserving, protecting, and restoring nature in and around urban areas is really a key part of what is framed as climate resilient development. A way to achieve climate resilient development, one of those ways is to invest in nature as our ally and to really leverage nature-based solutions for climate change adaptation. Another, which really echoes one of the core concerns in terms of risks, is the focus on protecting those that are most marginalized. And so in this assessment, we've really called out the need to focus on intersectional, gender responsive, and inclusive action that can accelerate the kinds of transformations that we need to achieve climate adaptation in ways that protect the most marginalized and the most vulnerable. What the report also does, though, is goes even further and shows that the literature is demonstrating that actually, when you prioritize investments for the most vulnerable, for the low income, marginalized residents, those that are living in informal settlements, the impact is actually larger. So this is framed here in this text as the greatest gains in well-being can be achieved this way. But this is what we're starting to see is not only is it important, but as my colleague Bill Selecki said in an event yesterday, it's not only about ethics, it's actually about impact, that we see more impact by focusing on the vulnerable and marginalized in terms of actual protection. Participation was really pointed out in our urban chapter as being critical for planning for achieving some of the equity goals that we have in climate change adaptation. So here, focusing on participatory planning, the inclusion of indigenous knowledge and local knowledge, focusing on communication and efforts that build local leadership among women and youth, and multiple types of inclusive approaches are ones that are being championed here as part of the solution space for adaptation, and ones that can help to achieve the equity goals that many of us have, and I know that we have here in the New York context, for leveling the playing field of who's most affected by climate change. And lastly, and this is really my last slide, and I'll hand it over to the rest of my panelists, is that a key finding from the report, and especially from chapter 6, which is the urban chapter, is that it's very much about how we mobilize policy planning and management at multiple levels and across multiple sectors. So here, thinking about the role and really leveraging the role of city and local governments that have the potential and power and even financial ability in some cases to invest directly in adaptation, but also important to mobilize private sector and even national agencies to address climate risk. So keeping in mind, this is really a global assessment. There's a focus on mobilizing not only political will and action, but finance through private and business investment in key infrastructure. And for example, safe and affordable housing, even the role of insurance, and helping to provide the bedrock support for adaptation action. So that's kind of my attempt to summarize in a hopefully not too long, relatively short space, a very long single chapter amidst a very long, over 3,000 pages report that assesses the literature on what some of the vulnerability that we have and what some of the adaptation opportunities are. And I'll hand it back to you, Mike, for the rest of our panelists to kind of comment what are we doing and what can we be doing in the New York City context to address the coming challenges that IPCC is saying that we will be facing.
Thank you for putting together that great summary and sort of packaging that stuff in a easy to digest manner. I'm sure as most of us have probably read these reports, fun times to read. But I wanted to just talk a little bit about how I wanted to have the discussion today. So I did pour through the reports, both the working group 2 and 3 reports, to get some questions for discussion. So I will ask each panelist a question, but also invite the rest of you to jump in as needed, and hopefully it leads to a really good conversation. So, would you like to go back and do number 6, Timon, or would you? Okay.
No, I'll let others take up the floor here. Thank you.
So for my first question, this is based on something I read from the working group 2 report, and this is going to be for Anna. As Timon mentioned, climate impacts on urban population health, livelihoods, and well-being are felt disproportionately, with the most economically and socially marginalized being the most affected. And right now we can see the effects of this in real time with things like COVID, with asthma rates across cities, with urban heat sickness, like the people that are most likely to be affected by that are the marginalized. So Anna, I wanted to know a little bit about how your work and with the NPCC Equity Group is looking to address issues like that. And I'd also like to hear a little bit about more of the national work that I know you've been doing as well, and how that all ties together.
Sure, yeah, and I'm gonna also definitely call in Sheila here because Sheila's the OG of the equity work group. She led the equity work group last time around in the last NPCC and now in this iteration. So I'm very lucky to be working with her with the NPCC this time around in the equity work group. And I think the approach is building from the last NPCC report and the amazing SOVI work, the Social Vulnerability Index work that they developed in that last NPCC report. So I think this time around, I think there's even a greater commitment and appreciation to how equity permeates all aspects of NPCC's work and how critical it is as a driving consideration across like very overlapping areas of work, whether it's heat, flooding, emergent threats. All of those things have to be put in the context of equity. And in particular, I think this time around, NPCC has engaged more forthrightly in a discussion of racial equity in particular, and how that plays a role in our work in setting the table for the research we're going to do. We even begin, I think, with a part of our chapter exploring the long history of dispossession, starting from pre-colonial to colonial times in the New York, what we call New York City, so-called Manhattan area, and follow that thread until present day, so that we have a real embedded context for understanding these disparities of risk and vulnerability in that historical context of race and colonization. So that's, I think, an important context setting question. I think the equity work group is also focused in on what have we learned since the last NPCC report, like how have social vulnerability metrics and indices and participatory planning processes, how has that informed the climate interventions that the city has undertaken, and where are best practices? We've had, since the last NPCC, we had Hurricane Ida, we had various events, including COVID, and where are those places that there are learning opportunities that we should be picking up on? And then another aspect of the work that we're very focused on right now is also the idea of climate displacement, both direct and indirect, and trying to understand and offer some guidance on best practices and methodologies that the city can apply when it thinks about climate interventions, climate adaptation and resiliency investments, how that does not in fact exacerbate underlying disparities in the housing market. There are all sorts of other vulnerabilities and risks that people face, in particular in a city like New York, where housing is so critical. We are trying to not only understand the climate risks, but how those climate risks overlay on things like displacement risks, and not having climate adaptation interventions do further harm to those communities, right? We really want to apply climate adaptation and resiliency in a manner that helps anchor communities and strengthen them and not displace them. So we are looking at best practices and metrics for that, and exploring many different approaches to those intersecting risks in New York City. I think on the national level, the thing I'll mention that I'm spending an inordinate amount of time on right now is the Justice 40, the Biden administration Justice 40 initiative out of Executive Order 14008, where they have committed publicly to directing 40% of investment benefits to quote unquote disadvantaged communities. And part of the recent, bipartisan infrastructure act that passed will have applications to Justice 40. There are 21 pilot Justice 40 programs, but there are hundreds, I would say over 300 or 400 federal programs, grant programs that may in fact be covered under this Justice 40 initiative. And we're talking about billions of dollars of federal funding that could potentially be redistributed in a manner that would potentially help the most vulnerable climate risk communities or environmental justice communities. But it is quite an undertaking to understand how federal funding flows to state and local governments, and how cities like New York can best be positioned, in particular those community advocates in environmental justice communities, to benefit and leverage that federal funding, because that scale of funding is the scale of funding that is needed. I think Timon, talked about the kinds of stranded assets and the kinds of like leveraging multi-scalar investments. And we are at a very important inflection point that if we, sort of this, so, they keep saying once in a generation opportunity to really leverage, major infrastructure dollars for good, hopefully for good, not for further harm. So, but that is going to take a tremendous amount of attention and advocacy and organizing to make that process work for communities that need it most. And so, it's not just going to naturally flow to places that are disadvantaged. So I can share more resources about Justice 40 in the chat. But I'll give it over to Sheila to say anything else about NPCC and her perspective on how we're attacking some of the issues Timon touched on.
Sure, thanks, Anna. And I think I was up next anyway, right, Mike? Did you want to?
And I do have a question for you, but I would like to see if you would like to add anything to Anna's points. And even after you, if there's anyone else that would like to add anything to that, please feel free.
Yeah, I mean, I will say that in general for the NPCC, the NPCC has been impaneled 4 times, just by way of a little background. And this last 2 times, the current NPCC on which we all sit, and then the previous one were the only 2 impanelings that put equity and now race firmly at the center of its work. I think that's very important because obviously the vulnerability of certain communities, in particular Black communities and more generally BIPOC communities, to the impacts of climate change is not just the result of a changed climate, and certainly not the result of chance. And so one of the things that we've been doing, both the previous NPCC is trying to map that vulnerability at the community and neighborhood level, but also to understand it in the context of what specific neighborhoods, what kind of characteristics they share, whether it's legacy pollutants in so-called environmental justice communities, or the lack of basic amenities and resources. And so I think it's important that when we talk about the chapter from IPCC in cities and urban areas, that we be sure to kind of make those connections between social vulnerability, but also historic factors. And I'm happy to talk about that a little bit more. But if anyone else wants to comment on what Anna said, but she and I are doing the heavy lift on this work this time around, and it's been challenging, but amazing to work together.
And I'm going to build on that, but does anyone else have anything they'd like to share before that? Looks like no. So yeah, the question I had for you, Sheila, after reading a lot of what quite a bit of what you've written that I could find, and about what you just mentioned, is about this equity piece. And again, I'm going to pull from one of the reports that says, and I quote, effective and equitable climate governance builds on engagement with civil society actors, political actors, businesses, youth, labor, media, indigenous people, and local communities. And this seems like a key component in a move toward a just transition, although I don't think a lot of people are particularly aware of this. And my question is, how can we not only raise awareness of this, because I know you've mentioned that in some of your writing, that we need that raising awareness is a very critical component to doing this work, but how can we make sure that it is embedded in policy and legal decisions across the country? Considering the political climate where we're in, where in some places you literally cannot talk about race, like it's being sort of erased, like 1984 style. So I wanted to know your thoughts on that. And yeah, I'd be curious to see if like what you have to say about that. And of course, the other panelists are welcome to jump into afterwards.
So one thing I think gives us a really good opening to center race in this political environment in the work of the NPCC is that we're set up to be the body of science and evidence, right? And that this is not just about kind of framing it normatively in a way that argues for race-specific solutions, because that's what we believe, but rather leaning in on the evidence. What does the evidence show us, for instance? I mean, so study after study is beginning to document that the impacts that BIPOC communities suffer from climate change are linked, evidence as a matter of evidence, to the history of redlining, for instance. I mean, let's just take redlining, right? We know that maps of the hottest urban heat islands in major American cities correspond almost directly to redline areas on maps from nearly a century ago, right? One study, for instance, I think was of over 100 and so urban areas nationwide, found that the formerly redline areas were hotter than non-redline areas by 13 degrees, right? The other thing that I think these studies are showing is that the reason some of these communities are left so vulnerable is because of the history of disinvestment in these communities. One kind of disinvestment, I mean, so we saw like in Hurricane Katrina, the failure to invest in like levees and hard infrastructure, but one kind of disinvestment are trees, right? So, studies are finding that these same communities that were redlined and are now hotter also wound up with fewer trees, and that there are more trees and more green space in wider, more affluent areas, right? And so formerly redline areas, again, as a matter of evidence, have about half as many trees today as white neighborhoods. And you can make the same kind of analysis based on the evidence of flood risk, right? A study of over 50 metro areas found that over $100 billion worth of homes at high risk for flooding are in historically red line and yellow line neighborhoods, and that there's a lack of investment historically in sewers, levees, and other infrastructure. And so, when we talk about kind of how do we create adaptation policy and how do cities respond to this, we can't continue to hew to the very technocratic idea of climate resilience, which is simply looking at, for instance, climate proofing urban infrastructures. Planting trees is good, but where do you plant trees, right? Investing in green structure, green roofs, rain gardens, restoration of wetlands is good. But if these interventions are simply accepting the status quo, which include baked in inequities, such as redlining, urban renewal, and housing discrimination, then I think one manifestation is what we're seeing. And Anna mentioned this. What we're seeing is another series of studies, about 3 or so that have come out, one from Philly, one from Miami, and one from post-Katrina New Orleans, that document how cities' investment in green infrastructure, including planting trees and other adaptation strategies, including retreat, result in the displacement of socially vulnerable residents in places like Little Haiti, right? In short, I think that the way we talk about race in this context is by leaning in on the science and the evidence, which shows a clear historical continuity between other facets of structural or systemic racism and climate impacts and the lack of climate resiliency and adaptation in these communities. And that's what we're trying to document. That's what we documented in NPCC 3 through SOBI mapping and through case studies of West Harlem, Southern Brooklyn, and Southern Bronx. And what we'll do this time when we really unpack this history, connect it to climate, and then look at the displacement risk index. So I'll stop there. I hope that answers your question, Mike.
Oh, yeah, no, that's a great answer. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. I do think, yeah, history is very, very important to understanding a lot of these issues. They are very historical issues, and to look at it as something as just this as a historical scientific problem does not get to where we need to be. And I wanted to open it up and see if anyone else had any thoughts about Sheila's comments or any thoughts about the question I just asked. So I'll give you some time, and in any case, Joel, you're on the hot seat next. So I wanted to see if anyone wanted to chip in about that.
And I'll invite my co-chair Anna to weigh in on anything I've said or to correct me, because usually
no corrections, Sheila. I mean, it's just like really amazing presentation of the facts, really the facts. And it's interesting because at the federal level, there's a tremendous amount of controversy about whether and how to even use race anymore related to for example, the climate and economic justice screening tool that is attached to the Justice 40 implementation has been scrubbed of race indicators because of fear of the judicial, striking down any race-based benefits. So there's a very alive debate about, whether or not to include race in any, even though we have decades of evidence of why this is such an important indicator. How can you talk about climate risks and resiliency and all this infrastructure when you don't even include race as an indicator? So it is very much in debate right now. So if any of you want to check out the beta version of this screening tool and see all the communities that it misses, middle and even low income Black communities that are not on this screening tool.
And if I may just say one thing about the legal stuff that they're afraid of, I think it's really misguided, right? To take race out, because it's not like university admissions or even the farmers. One of the things that's spooking the Biden administration, seems to me, and it's been documented, is that they've been tied up in court trying to give Black farmers relief, right? And the courts have looked askance at the use of race. But we also know from the court cases and the jurisprudence that if this stuff is grounded in evidence, if you have evidence of a direct link of the kind of studies I've quoted, between racial impacts and racial discrimination and specific, state-based policy or other policies, then that is good enough usually to support race consciousness. So I'm supportive of a lot of what the Biden administration is doing, but I actually think just legally it's misguided to be so spooked out on the use of race. So I'll just stop there.
Oh, no, I agree with that. I read that story about the farmers, and that was devastating to read. Like there's proof of decades and decades of discrimination. And then, I'm a little bit disappointed when I see that the Biden administration does not fight for these things. And I think that's a great point you brought up, Anna. And I would argue that race has been a determining factor. It just was not, historically, a determining factor for a lot of things in this country. It just only went to white people for the most part. Like you look at the GI Bill, 98% of those loans, which helped create wealth and created the wealth gap in the United States, went to white people. So there are a lot of programs that are race-based, but they just are sort of invisibilized because of the nature of the country we live in. And next, on that note, I'll be passing it to Joel. And I have another quote that I found that was very interesting. And this is actually from the Working Group 3 report on mitigation. And I am, hopefully this question isn't too prickly, but it says around half of all modeled global emission scenarios assume cost-effective approaches that rely on least cost emission abatement options globally. The other half looks at existing policies and regionally and sectorally differentiated actions. Most do not make explicit assumptions about global equity, environmental justice, or intra-regional income distribution. So it's not really looking at these equity issues, and this is in the report. But my question for you is, what roles can panels like the IPCC and MPCC play in increasing the likelihood of an equitable and just transition? So yeah, I just wanted to hear your thoughts about that. And again, any of the other panelists are able to feel free to chip in about that as well.
Thanks, Mike. And the pricklier the question, the better, in my opinion. So thank you for that. And first of all, happy Earth Week. I don't know if we said that at the beginning. And also, I know my colleagues would also say the same. I think it's important in these events that we really begin with acknowledging the land that we're on. And I'm sitting in a very cold office at the New School on Lenape land. And the question of the kind of knowledge that we bring to bear in relationship to climate, and Timon mentioned this in his overview, and it's really works its way through much of the equity chapter that's in development that Anna and Sheila are leading, also calls on us to be paying attention to Indigenous knowledge and history. And so I think, Mike, to your specific question, and really building on Sheila's last comment about the way the New York City Panel on Climate Change reports work, is that we are driven by the science. And what you heard Timon say about the IPCC, and in particular, the link between the increased impact when focusing investment in historically disadvantaged and marginalized communities is one of the ways that you start to impact that economic analysis that you were questioning, Mike. And because the data is strong that reinforce the value in both equity terms and economic terms in making the right kinds of investments, the kinds of investments that will benefit communities at higher risk and where there has been a strong disinvestment over time, and where there's a long history of structural racism. And so NPCC as a group, we're linked, literally linked in our mandate from local law to the IPCC. And so in part, this event, it makes a lot of sense because of the release of Working Group 2 and then most recently Working Group 3 reports, because that triggers our local law mandate to release an NPCC data report roughly within a year of the IPCC. It's when NPCC was established in 2012, that was the triggering mechanism. And so we are gathered as a group in relationship to science that's happening at a global scale, or the assessment of science that's happening at a global scale. And our task, what we do and what we don't do, our task is to evaluate, assess that science, and scale it to New York City in order to provide the policymakers with the most relevant, policy relevant information. And so one of the ways that a group like ours can have impact, to your question, is to really, and as Sheila said, to make the commitment to centering environmental justice issues in our assessment report, because that becomes, by law, essentially the current state of knowledge in relationship to climate that policymakers then need to take into account in their policy making. Now, it doesn't guarantee they're going to do it, right? We'd be naive to think that that was just because we say this has very strong impact or it matters and the data support it. It doesn't mean policymakers will follow the science. We've all experienced administrations that ignore the science. However, it's, I think, critical that we're laying that foundation in such a way that we are able to call on it, and in an open society to challenge when policy does not respond in the best interests of the city itself. So it's, the last thing I would say, and I meant to say this at the beginning, NPCC has a long history. Sheila mentioned in particular NPCC 3, and Timon mentioned Bill Selecki by name. I wanted to add to that Cynthia Rosenzweig, who were the two co-chairs of the first 3 NPCC reports. They have such big shoes to fill that it takes 5 of us to be co-chairs in the second round of this. And it's a hugely important process that the city is committed to this kind of independent scientific analysis around the issues of climate change and increasingly climate change and environmental justice. And we currently work within the administration, within the New York City structure, with the recently renamed Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice. And that's no small semantic shift, I don't think, because the NPCC report, which is centering environmental justice, is going to a mayor's office that is centering environmental justice. And in a context in which many local laws and ambitions of the city have in recent years been clear about the importance of this work, and we're providing scientific basis, policy relevant basis to support that. So I think that's the only way I know how to do that, that work, and hopefully the results start to skew in the favor of justice.
Oh, thank you for sharing. And does anyone else have anything to remark on Joel's comments? I think, Timon, are you also you're also on the NPC? Are you on the NPCC this year, or were you on? Yeah. So yeah, I just want to see
the panel of NPCC folks here.
Yeah, it's all, all NPCC people. So I actually do have a question for you, Timon. A surprise question, but I wanted to know if you had anything that you wanted to add about working on both panels, the NPCC and IPCC, and if were there any intersections that you saw in that work?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. I think one of the things that's really challenging at the global level and is particularly stressful in getting the report finished, as others who've worked on this before would know, is that all the nation states actually have to sign off on the report. And so this is something that I think is often people tend to criticize the IPCC process in terms of what the science can say. And this is a little bit different. And Joel, you may want to come back and comment on this in terms of the NPCC process, but there's literally line by line negotiations on the particular word choices that are allowed to be released. And in the IPCC report, and in some cases, words get taken out because a particular nation will object to it. And the report cannot be released until there is consensus, until literally everyone signs off. And so this is a challenge, and it's something that is sort of source of frustration, I think, among scientists and others working on this, is that the assessment goes through basically a policy screening for what the willingness to accept findings is among the nation states. And as you can imagine, at the global level, there's very different opinions depending on administrations that are in power within different nations. And yet, as much as that might seem, well, I can imagine, and I've had this reaction myself, as a process that just sort of seems wrong in a way of not being able to let 100% of the science to speak for itself, because it's actually filtered through this other policy process. The audience is policymakers. And so the relevance, as Joel was kind of pointing out, in influencing national policy all around the world, and even global targets and goals, things that have gotten wrapped up in the sustainable development goals and other kinds of goals, is about making sure that the science can speak to policy. And so we have to do that work of working with policymakers in a way that we can influence it. It's not a perfect process. And I think to your question, there's similarities in the local New York City assessment process with NPCC and our work with the city of New York. But it's also a bit different because we're not trying to necessarily satisfy this nation state and that nation state on a particular issue or a particular line in the same way. And so I think we actually have more agency in really centering, for example, as we've been talking about issues of equity and justice in a way that we can leverage and also push a scientific agenda, and not in a normative sense, as Sheila was saying, but in what we can focus on in terms of what is actually in the literature and what we know we have evidence for in terms of influencing local policy. And as Joel said, we don't make the policy, but we can provide the evidence base for it. And I think that goes a long way towards starting to shift the conversation in a way that can have impact. And that hopefully is why NPCC exists. It's why also at the national level, national climate assessment exists, is to do that work nationally as well.
Yeah,
And
Joel, do you have anything to add? Oh,
yeah,
sorry.
I just wanted to add something to Timons because it's one of the great things about perspective, right? The IPCC helps us think that the politics in New York are much easier to manage.
That's true.
Yeah, I mean,
I was setting that up to make us all feel better.
appreciate that. Yeah, I mean, it's, as I said, I don't want us to, I wouldn't suggest ever that we're being naive about it, but there is an independence to our work. The panel protects that independence. But it's also the case, and even in the structuring of the local law that mandates the NPCC, we have collaborators in the city that play that filtering role that Timon's talking about. There's something called the CCATF, in case you haven't gotten enough acronyms for the day. The Climate Change Adaptation Task Force is brought into being at the same time as the NPCC by the same local law, and functions as a kind of vehicle through which the science is then kind of distributed among the various different agencies and utilities and so forth. And so there's a kind of power balancing that goes on in that context. And at the same time, and we should, I think, mention the places where I think there's been great additional progress. A couple of years ago, another local law was written that brought into being the first Environmental Justice Advisory Board, EJAB, which is, I would say, I think many of us on NPCC see that as a kind of sister organization in the sense that they are charged, like we are, with producing materials and reports that evaluate, provide evidence on the state of environmental justice in New York City and in the ways in which the city must take that into policy account. And so there's always this filtering, and I'm not so sure that I think it's bad that there's filtering. It's kind of democratic that there's filtering, but it's not without its complications, I would say.
Oh, yeah, thanks for answering that, Joel, and adding that. And so, Timon, that actually wasn't my question, but like, I know I'm familiar with the work that you all do at the Urban Systems Lab, because you just right down the hall from where the Tishman Center is. And you mentioned this at the very beginning, so I wanted to circle back on this. That like that you said, like more than 1 billion people located in low-lying cities and settlements will be at risk from coast-specific climate hazards, aka coastal flooding and things like that. And you did talk about a little bit about having nature-based solutions. So I just wanted you to expand on that. Why aren't we seeing more nature-based solutions and lots of things? Like we need to have more seawalls and like all this very hard infrastructure. Yeah, I would just be curious to see your thoughts on why we aren't doing things like protecting wetlands and emulating natural water abatement strategies.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. I mean, on the one hand, I think we are seeing more investments in nature-based solutions, both here in New York City, especially post-Hurricane Sandy, dune restoration, wetland protection, investments in oyster reefs and oyster beds along the coast have been prioritized along with other kinds of investments. And we're seeing this scale up nationally and internationally. On the other hand, one of the findings from the IPCC report is that the investments have not been made at the scale that we need them to actually address the adaptation challenge that we're facing already, let alone the adaptation challenge that we're going to face over the next 10 to 20 years, at least, if not beyond that. So it's clear that we need much larger scale investments. And I think one of the challenges, and this comes from the IPCC report, but there's plenty of literature on this that is assessed in the report, but also new work that's coming out recently that is making it clear that we have to have a better understanding of the economic value of nature-based solutions. There's critique at, you can even think about this as a building owner in New York City who might see a green roof as a potential option to invest in. Sheila, you were mentioning green roofs and other things that don't necessarily solve our equity or vulnerability challenges, but are being looked at as some of these solutions. And if you sort of bring this into a cost benefit analysis kind of framing, and you look at what we know about the value of green roofs and their return on investment and their sort of upfront costs, in some cases, it's hard to say that they're cost effective, especially for certain kinds of buildings. And in other kinds of buildings, you get an answer that says, oh, it's very cost effective. But the limitation here is, what are we actually bringing into that calculation? The benefits for mental health of even seeing a green roof outside your window are clearly documented in the medical literature, or for physical health in terms of new spaces for recreation in places that may not have them are documented in medical literature, but we don't have a very good way of actually understanding the monetary benefit. So it doesn't get included in cost benefit analysis that then result in, oh, this is cost effective or not cost effective. So I can get into the weeds a little bit further on this if we want to, but overall, I think we have a major limitation in enough evidence on the economic side in terms of the environmental economic analyses that can provide a broader suite of benefits that we can tally up to really argue from an economic perspective why we should be investing in these kinds of nature-based solutions. I think that will change over time, but it's going to change because we're going to find and develop ways to better bring the economic value of nature-based solutions into these analyses. And as we know, whether we like it or not, a lot of decisions, and perhaps we might even say the majority of decisions that cities and even communities are making are driven by these kinds of cost benefit approaches. So we're kind of stuck with the need to advance economic valuation across a broad suite of potential benefits that nature provides: mental health, physical health, climate regulation, from stormwater absorption to heat reduction and cooling, to wave attenuation and storm surge attenuation in coastal areas. These are things that we might know work and we might know can help us with adaptation, but we don't necessarily know how to value them appropriately. And especially when you think about the broad suite of benefits that really are the argument for why we shouldn't be investing in nature-based solutions as one of the solutions to how we adapt to climate change. The only other thing I'll say with that is that, talking about nature-based solutions is great. I'm an ecologist. This is sort of, things I care about and work on and study, but they won't solve the climate crisis. And as Sheila was pointing out, if you invest in them in the wrong ways, then we can actually reinforce the status quo of who's most vulnerable, who's actually gaining benefit from these kinds of investments. So on their own, they don't necessarily solve the challenges that we face with disproportionate climate impacts and the injustice of how climate impacts certain communities. And they're not really up to the challenge all on their own either without other kinds of gray infrastructure investments. So they need to be coupled with multiple social infrastructural solutions. And it's clear that they have to be thought of in coupled ways so that we can make sure that they're not driving displacement or other kinds of harms that so many other kinds of investments in cities have done already in the past. And that's something that we can raise the awareness around, but there's still work to do to figure out how to do that best, such as coupling investments in small pocket parks and neighborhoods with investments in low income housing, with investments in rent stabilization, right? These are things that are difficult to couple in the siloed way in which we sort of make investments and make decisions in cities, but we're going to have to solve that if we're going to solve some of these knock-on effects that we're trying to avoid.
Thank you for providing that context. And before I ask anything else, does anyone, Sheila or Anna, do you have anything you'd like to add or expand on to Timon's point?
No, well said.
And speaking of something that Timon just mentioned in terms of displacement, I wanted to quote something that I believe you wrote about climate displacement that also made me think about this, because I think we probably will see climate displacement even within the United States. So one of the things you wrote, and this is again, going back to those knock-on effects, climate, and I'm going to paraphrase, climate displacement will not occur in isolation, but in conjunction with migration already driven by economic, social, or security reasons, which you can even see in New York City with like the flooding in the Rockaways, where people would have to forced managed retreat, or however we put it. So I wanted to hear a little bit more about your thoughts on what that would look like in a domestic context, because I think when people often think about migration, they think about things that are happening in other countries, like in Syria, or now what we're seeing in Ukraine, or other areas where there's conflict. But like you said, there are a lot of things that tie into each other. So I was curious to see, like not even in New York, but we may even see it in New York, but like in a domestic context, what is something that we should be thinking about in terms of migration and displacement?
Are you asking Timon?
Oh, no, I was asking you.
I thought you were asking Sheila.
Yeah, I was asking you,
okay.
Sheila.
I'm sorry. So how do we think about displacement, right? So certainly after a climate shock, a hurricane, right? Whether it's Harvey, whether it's, Ida, flooding displacement, whether it's Katrina, we see climate displacement so one of the things we're distinguishing between, and Anna can help me out here, is between kind of indirect and direct, right? So indirect displacement, there's a climate shock and people are pushed out of their homes. And that, I think, most resonates with some of what we're seeing internationally, not so much between countries, but within countries. Most migration, climate fueled migration is internal to countries. So in Africa, from rural areas to urban areas. But the kind of displacement we're also focused on, of course, that kind of displacement matters a lot, especially if you're in coastal areas or low-lying areas, is what we call indirect climate displacement. And that's a bit of more of a wicked problem, right? Because of the ways in which it's overlaid with the kinds of histories that we've been talking about and that I spoke about earlier. And we think that we should focus on that kind of displacement for the same reasons that in the last IPCC, we began to focus on not just ecological vulnerability, but social vulnerability, which is to say that you're not forgetting about the impacts of climate or the ecological vulnerability, but you can only understand those in the context of larger systems. And so in the case of social vulnerability, who has access to health insurance, who has access to a car, not necessarily in New York, right? What's the quality of housing? So if people are particularly vulnerable to climate change, you have to look at how they're vulnerable, or maybe they're living in a community with a lot of kind of groundwater or soil contaminant. And if we get large rains, they're going to be exposed to that. So with displacement, as we're adapting to climate or the risk, what we know is coming and bound to get worse, how do we start to think about preparing the urban environment? And in New York City, that's at the it has to be at the neighborhood and community level. Why? Because each of these communities has different overlays of social, economic, as well as ecological factors that put them at different kinds of risk. And so what we're trying to do is to think about, and there are some metrics that exist, but how do we bring the science of the evidence of that displacement being likely? I mentioned some emerging studies, but also how do we give the city metrics for when it goes to make an investment or it goes to think about a particular adaptation strategy, a green roof or the urban tree canopy. Are there metrics that the city can also use that might suggest there are displacement risks in doing that adaptation investment in a particular way? So the key takeaway here is kind of there's direct displacement and then there's indirect climate displacement. Anna, do you want to add to this?
Yeah, I would just say that we can see it happening. It's one of the real examples, right? After Sandy, there were entire communities in Staten Island. They're moderate income communities. Some of them chose to retreat, like they participated in buyout programs. Some were lower income residents are often forced to retreat, right? They don't have the capital to rebuild their homes, or they're renters and they no longer have access to those homes. The wealthy, like along many of the coastlines that were hit during Sandy, would never retreat. They'll just build, they'll spend millions of dollars, some of it your tax dollars, to raise their homes higher and put more sand in front of their properties. So there's a very inequitable treatment of how people, the kind of agency they have around the displacement effect, and we see in places like Miami, and the study shows clearly that when higher elevations start to become more and more, popular in the real estate sector, and then all of a sudden people get priced out of their homes. And that's clearly happening all over the city of New York, with and without climate risk, in terms of what properties start to become more viable, with additional investments in, green infrastructure, in all sorts of things that make an area more palatable and more attractive to the whims of the private real estate market, right? In a tight housing market like New York City, who has agency and who has the mobility and the choice? Low income, often marginalized communities don't have those same choices. And so the way that the New York City chooses to enter into climate interventions, housing interventions, matters tremendously for the prospects for those communities that don't have the same mobility choices. So how Lower Manhattan gets treated post Hurricane Sandy versus Edgemere, or the Rockaways, or whatever the communities are, it makes a huge amount of difference. And let's face it, like the FEMA Hazard Mitigation Fund, they're calculating building value, property loss. They're not looking at equity metrics the way we're thinking about it. So it's I think, a very important part of what we need to consider going forward in a place like New York City, for sure.
Thank you, Anna. And I do have some questions, some other questions. I have one I wanted to ask you, Anna, about some point you just made, but I also wanted to open up the questions to the audience. So please, if you have any questions for the panelists, put them in the chat and I can read them out. And hopefully that, we can answer them. But in the meantime, Anna, I did want to ask you, as someone who's been a climate advocate, an environmental justice advocate for a bit of time, I'll say. I would like to know, in your work with the NPCC, where does the role of advocacy come in on that? Like in terms of either bringing that in or using these reports as tools that climate and environmental justice advocates can use?
That's a good question. Maybe Sheila has more thoughts on that. I mean, my thinking going into it was that, yes, we're giving guidance to the city of New York, and we're giving them some, evidence-based, science-based research that they could and should apply. But I do think there's another audience, right, which is the advocates who need to organize to ensure that those interventions and the kinds of evidence that the NPCC brings forward will, make tangible improvements in their communities, and that it's readable, right? Like that it's accessible, usable information that advocates can put into action, because NPCC is not an advocacy group, but we hopefully what we produce will hopefully can be put to good use, not just by the city of New York, but by advocates. That's the hope, I think.
Yeah, I would agree. when we undertook the work of NPCC 3, the last iteration, we invited 3 community-based environmental justice organization groups to kind of co-produce and co-author that report with us because of what they were already doing in their communities, right? They were already not just advocating, but some of them had been immensely effective in the policy arena in New York City. We're already engaged with the mayor's office, already engaged with their community boards, already engaged in urban planning and climate planning. And so good science and good evidence can feed into what a lot of advocates and community-based groups are already engaged in. So both including them in our work, and now that there's, Joel mentioned the Environmental Justice Advisory Board, that wasn't set up the last time, but now that advocacy and community-based orientation is coming more from that body, but we'll be working close with them. But I think as Anna said, you know, this will be out there and it'll be published and it'll be peer reviewed. So people who are advocating and pushing for solutions can take this and say, this is good evidence about what we're talking about and about the need for solutions. So I think there's a direct connection.
Oh, thank you both. Yeah, I hope that is, I'm sure that, like, I hope in the future that's the case. And I have a question for all of you. Basically, are there any other points that you would like to personally share that I didn't get to with our questions or no one answered? Or is there something that another panelist remarked on that you would like to follow up with or expand on or talk about? So I can start with, I'll start with Timon since everyone else is gone. So yeah, Timon, I want to see if there's anything else that you wanted to add, or if there's anything else that we talked about today that you wanted to talk more about.
Well, maybe to come back and like throw a term I'm not sure we've used out, but we've talked a little bit about it already. And this is something that has really been sort of a high level talking point from the IPCC report, which is the concern about what we call maladaptation, meaning efforts to do adaptation that actually don't work, or that cause other harms that aren't intended. So we talked a little bit about that in terms of the ways in which some investments in greening are related to other kinds of gentrification processes that cause displacement, and there's complexities with that. But I just kind of wanted to bring this up too, because I think it's something that, one, we have to be aware of is already happening. And that's one of the findings from IPCC, is that maladaptation is already happening. Investments in infrastructure, other kinds of investments are being made for the sake of climate adaptation, but actually are maladaptive. And I'll give a couple quick examples. And these are things that we have to be on the alert for, learn to better recognize, and in terms of how we sort of, make new plans, make new policies that are going to invest in communities in particular ways, that we avoid them. So, one really maybe easy example to think about, doesn't feel too controversial as a starting point, is the way in which we may invest in nature-based solutions and invest in the wrong species that aren't actually adapted for the changing climate that we have. And so you're spending all of these dollars and community resources for species that essentially are not going to be able to live in the changing climate and microclimates that are really rapidly changing in cities, right? In New York City, we have to think about, are we planting the right species of trees, even if tree planting is the right answer in a place, which it may or may not be in particular communities. So, as I said, that's made sound kind of less controversial, but it's still a concern because we're talking about limited resources. How do we mobilize finance, long time frames to get these investments up and running? And if you're making basically the wrong choices and what you're putting in a local place that isn't adapted or going to be adapted in 10 or 20 years to that local context, then essentially you're investing in a maladaptation. Maybe something more controversial is thinking about gray infrastructure investments such as seawalls or storm surge barriers that the literature is already showing are causing people to have a false sense of security that, oh, I'm protected from climate change now, so we can put businesses and residences, behind these walls, which are built to a certain point, but depending on the climate scenario that we may be facing in the near future, they may be even worse or at-risk areas in the future. And so the ways in which certain kinds of adaptation options can create these false senses of security and actually mobilize development in at-risk areas is another one of these concerns. And there's documented cases of where this is already starting to happen. So I just bring that up as another point that is maybe kind of zeroing in on some concerns we have about how adaptation options can reinforce racist policies. They can reinforce investments in areas that actually we're going to have to, over time, learn to leave and figure out the right process to leave. You know, picking up on this other points from the report that say that in some areas they're just not going to be able to be adapted in the kinds of futures that are being projected with strong likelihood. So that's just the only thing I kind of wanted to add into this context, especially from the IPCC perspective. But I know Sheila and Anna, this is being picked up in the New York City panel on climate change concerns too. How do we make sure that we're making the right investments that are responsive to place, responsive to social and cultural context, responsible to the ecological context, and the way in which these things are changing really dynamically? It's not an easy problem to solve, but it's something that, again, if the evidence is helping highlight that, we can be aware and we can start to make better decisions.
Oh, thank you, Timon. Anna, did you, same question for you. Did you have anything that you wanted to add to what Timon said, or are there any points that we didn't get to that you would like to highlight, or are there any other points that someone said that you would like to expand on?
No, I think everybody covered everything. I was going to put in the chat box the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers seawall focus feasibility study. For those of you who think that's not a possibility here, their federal government is spending lots of good hard-earned money on looking at crazy seawall schemes. So yes, we have to be on the alert for all kinds of maladaptations. Yeah, and a retrenchment of sort of business as usual, I think.
And Sheila, is there any points that you would like to get to that we didn't quite reach during the discussion, or is there anything that you would like to remark on that you've heard?
No, I think we've covered it. I appreciate the conversation. I think the one thing we didn't really talk about that's part of our work too is that, you know, we are starting to think about best practices to try to capture, because it's one thing to just keep saying what the problem is, but it's another thing to offer solutions. And again, we're not a policy body, but we are an evidentiary body, and there is some evidence out there that maybe some localities or even communities are trying to get this balance right between kind of investment, you know, adaptation, investment, and being responsive to the needs of particular communities in light of what we understand is kind of the history and the landscape, the social and economic landscape upon which they're kind of existing, right? And challenged by. And so I guess I just want to encourage anybody on the call that if they know of good examples from around the world, let us know of best practices.
Oh, thank you. And yeah, I didn't see any audience questions. So yeah, I just wanted to thank all of the panelists. I think that was a really great and far-ranging discussion. We talked about, I think we touched on a lot of things. And for those of you all who are very wonky, you can read the Working Group 2 and Working Group 3 reports on the IPCC site. And when is the NPCC report due to come out? Is it this year or next year? If any of the panelists are aware, or if
We
you
can
all-
give a
Next year, right?
Yeah, can we give a nuanced answer? So there'll be some interim report at the end of this year, because Joel kind of alluded to this 1-year cycle after IPCC. And then, you know, the following year, we'll put out a more complete assessment.
Thanks. What's up? Does someone else saying? Sheila, were you, or Anna, were you saying something? All right, yeah, and I also would like to thank everyone for coming to this event, which is, like Chris said at the beginning, part of the Earth Week events that we're planning at the new school and at the Tishman Center. So tomorrow we're going to have an event with Joel again that he will be moderating about the future of the streets and in New York City. So we're going to have some really interesting design people, advocates for EJ there. And I will not be speaking, but I'm sure it'll be a great conversation. And then next Friday, we're having an event with Bomba Estéreo, who is, if you all like cumbia or music from Colombia, it'll be really interesting. And it's going to be the second sort of a companion piece to the event that we had on the 14th about music, food, and environmental justice. And yeah, if you're interested, you can check out the Tishman Center website, which is just tishmancenter.org, and you can see what we have. And I can pass it back to Chris to see if there's anything else that he would like to add. So again, thank you all for letting me moderate this discussion, and I really learned a lot. So thank you to all the panelists and the people that attended today.
Thanks, Mike, and thanks, Anna and Sheila.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks so much, Mike. I think that was great. Again, thank you everybody for attending. We will follow up with a recording, a link to the recording, and some other additional resources. So stay tuned in your email. Thanks again, and have a great afternoon. Happy Earth Week, everybody.
Earth Week.
Thanks all. Take care. Be safe.